the most uncomfortable wedding you've ever been to? Story 1. I was at my cousin's wedding a few years ago, and honestly, I still cringe when I think about it. First of all, my cousin's bride was this woman I barely knew, but she seemed nice enough when they started dating. That is, until the wedding. From the moment we entered the venue, it was clear something wasn't right. The atmosphere was tense, with no one really talking, just quietly sitting and waiting. Then, about halfway through the ceremony, my cousin's ex showed up. Yes, the ex. Apparently, there had been a misunderstanding about whether or not she was invited. The bride freaked out, and there was an awkward confrontation in front of everyone. The ex demanded to speak to the groom in private, and they ended up disappearing for what felt like hours. The guests were left hanging, unsure if the wedding would even continue. When they finally came back, the mood had shifted from one of celebration to pure discomfort. My cousin looked guilty, the bride looked furious, and the rest of us? We just sat there in silence, unsure of what we were witnessing. It was supposed to be a day of joy, but it ended up being one of the most painfully awkward events of my life. Story 2. So, this happened at a friend's wedding about 5 years ago. The ceremony was fine, nothing out of the ordinary, but the reception? That was a different story. The bride had asked for a family member, an older cousin, to give a toast. And while I didn't expect it to be the next Oscar-worthy speech, I also didn't expect him to get so uncomfortable. He started by talking about how great the couple was, but then things quickly took a weird turn. He began recounting a story from when he and the bride were kids, where they apparently shared a very awkward secret together. I'm talking childhood pranks that went a little too far, way too far. Then, he pulled out photos of the bride at a very awkward age with braces and crazy hair, and started showing them to everyone. You could see the bride's face turning bright red, and her new husband looked like he was about to lose it. The guests started whispering, and it was clear everyone was feeling extremely uncomfortable. The bride finally cut him off mid-story, and while we all laughed nervously, the tension in the room never really left. It was as if we were all collectively trying to pretend the awkwardness didn't exist. But it did. Story 3. I'll never forget my friend's wedding. It was supposed to be the perfect day for her, but it turned into something much, much worse. She had a beautiful outdoor ceremony in a garden, and everything was going well. Until her mom got involved. She kept interrupting the ceremony, offering unsolicited advice to the couple about how to live happily ever after. The worst part? Her mom didn't stop there. During the vows, she began loudly whispering to everyone around her about how the groom wasn't good enough for her daughter and how she thought they rushed into things. When it came time for the first dance, the mom got up and started dancing with her daughter, stealing the spotlight. The groom stood off to the side, looking completely defeated. At this point, everyone was trying to act like it wasn't a big deal, but it was so obvious. The bride was visibly uncomfortable, but didn't know how to tell her mom to back off without causing a scene. It just turned into a huge mess. At the reception, I overheard some of the guests whispering about how awkward the situation was, and it was clear that no one was really enjoying the celebration. It was one of those weddings where everyone was just waiting for it to end. Story 4. Okay, this is one of those stories that will make you question how this even happened. My cousin got married, and the whole ceremony seemed pretty standard at first. But as soon as the vows started, it was like a switch flipped. The groom, who had been calm and collected up until this point, suddenly started crying. Really crying. Not just a few tears, but full-on sobbing. We all assumed it was because he was overwhelmed with joy. But then he started whispering to the bride about how much he loved her. Really loudly. Like almost yelling. And then it got weirder. He started talking about their future kids and how he couldn't wait to have a little version of her running around. The bride was so visibly uncomfortable that she actually stepped back a bit and looked at him like she wasn't sure who he was anymore. People started awkwardly shifting in their seats, unsure whether they should laugh or just keep quiet. The ceremony dragged on for what felt like an eternity, with the groom sobbing the entire time, while the bride stood there, trying to hold it together. By the time they finally kissed and walked down the aisle, it was clear this wedding would be talked about for years to come. Story 5. I was invited to a wedding a few years ago where the groom and his family had a strange tradition. Apparently, before the wedding, they always do a gift exchange, where the groom's family gives personal gifts to the bride's family. It's all supposed to be a fun bonding experience. But this particular exchange, it went terribly wrong. The groom's father handed my cousin's mom a very unusual gift, a stuffed bear. And not just any stuffed bear, but one that had some really inappropriate markings on it. My cousin's mom, clearly confused and uncomfortable, opened the gift in front of everyone, and you could immediately see the tension build up. The groom's dad insisted it was a family heirloom, but my cousin's mom didn't know what to do with it. She looked at the groom's dad, then at the bear, and then at everyone else. The awkward silence was deafening. My cousin's mom finally mumbled something about how different it was, but it was clear that no one was comfortable with what had just happened. It took an hour for the awkwardness to die down, and by the time the reception came around, no one was really in the mood to celebrate. It was a wedding I won't ever forget, but I really wish I could. Story 6. I attended my college roommate's wedding last summer, and it was honestly one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. I didn't know her fiancé very well, but from the stories I'd heard, he was a bit eccentric. However, I didn't realize just how strange he was until the reception. Everything was going fine. Dinner, drinks, people mingling, but then the groom suddenly took the mic. He gave this thank you speech, which turned into something else entirely. He started talking about how, in his past relationships, he had been a wild man, explaining his history of partying, staying out all night, and dating multiple people at once. He told this entire room of strangers about his various ex-girlfriends and how much he'd learned from them, while the bride stood next to him, clearly uncomfortable but smiling through it. At one point, he even went into detail about a particularly embarrassing breakup where he said, "I should have known better, but she was a freak in bed, so I just let it slide." The whole room fell silent. My friend, the bride, was now as red as a tomato, and you could tell she was regretting her choice to allow him to speak. It was so uncomfortable that even the most enthusiastic wedding guests started looking at each other awkwardly. The bride eventually had to cut him off, but the damage was done. The rest of the night was spent with people trying to act like it hadn't happened, but the awkwardness lingered in the air. Story 7. This one comes from a friend of mine who attended her cousin's wedding a few years ago. The wedding was at a beautiful old church with classic decorations, and everything seemed perfect, until the best man got up to give his speech. Everyone expected it to be sweet and funny, but it quickly turned into something horrifying. The best man, who was also the groom's childhood friend, began his speech by talking about how the groom and the bride were perfect for each other, but then started reminiscing about their teenage years. It was clear he was drunk and the stories took a dark turn. He started recounting all these wild moments, but not in a charming, "remember when we were kids" kind of way. Instead, he started talking about how the groom used to hook up with random women all the time, including a particularly scandalous story about a girl who definitely didn't look like she belonged in that crowd. The groom was trying to smile through it, but you could see he was visibly uncomfortable. The bride, however, looked like she wanted to crawl into a hole. She was tearing up, and the room went completely silent as the best man kept going. At one point, he even mentioned that he thought this wedding was a joke because he didn't think the groom would ever settle down. By the time the speech was over, the bride was in tears and guests didn't know how to respond. The tension hung in the air for the rest of the evening, and the reception felt more like a somber wake than a celebration. Story 8. I went to a wedding last year where everything seemed to be going according to plan until the bride's father took the stage for his speech. Now, let me start by saying that this guy had a bit of a reputation for being eccentric. He was loud, opinionated, and not one to shy away from making things uncomfortable, but no one expected what came next. He began by talking about how he had always wanted his daughter to marry someone worthy of her. Okay, fair enough. But then he started listing off her past boyfriends in excruciating detail, how none of them were good enough, how they had all broken her heart, and how lucky the groom was to have finally come along. That wasn't the worst part, though. The worst part was when he started telling embarrassing stories about his daughter. He shared anecdotes about her childhood, some of which were incredibly embarrassing, like the time she peed her pants in front of all her friends at a school play. He even brought up her teenage years, revealing some cringeworthy details about her awkward crushes. The groom was clearly cringing. And the bride? She was trying to laugh it off, but you could see she was fighting back tears. It was one of those moments where everyone was awkwardly laughing, but you could feel the discomfort in the air. By the time the speech ended, the entire room was silent, and people were just waiting for it to be over. It wasn't funny, it wasn't sweet, it was just plain uncomfortable. Story 9. A few years ago, I went to a wedding where the bride had invited a few people from her workplace, and the whole thing went south very quickly. It was a small wedding, and the couple had chosen to keep it casual, so most of the guests were just family and close friends. But when the reception began, the bride's coworker, who was apparently one of her best friends, got up to give a toast. I thought it would be sweet, but it was anything but. The coworker started by saying that she was so happy for the bride and groom, and then she proceeded to tell a series of stories about the bride's unusual habits. She mentioned how the bride always used to call her in the middle of the night, crying over her relationship issues. Then she casually dropped the bombshell that the bride had been dating someone else just a month before the wedding. The coworker didn't go into too many details, but it was clear that she was hinting at an affair. The bride's face went white, and her new husband looked like he had just been slapped. It took the bride a minute to compose herself before she awkwardly asked her coworker to sit down. But the damage was done. People were whispering, and you could feel the atmosphere turn tense and uncomfortable. The rest of the reception was filled with uncomfortable silences and forced smiles, and no one really knew what to say. It was one of those moments where you wished you could just disappear and pretend it never happened. Story 10. I've been to some awkward weddings, but this one was something else. It was my older sister's wedding, and while she and her husband were in love, there was one thing that no one could have predicted: the arrival of the bride's ex-boyfriend. This guy had been in her life for a while, and they had broken up a year before the wedding, but apparently he didn't get the memo that the relationship was over. During the ceremony, he showed up uninvited, and he didn't just sit quietly in the back like most crashers would. Instead, he marched straight to the front of the aisle, stood there for a few seconds, and then yelled out, "I still love you!" The groom looked like he was about to lose it. And my sister? She was frozen, staring at him in shock. The officiant tried to keep going, but the ex didn't stop. He began pleading with my sister, telling her how they were meant to be together, and how she was making a huge mistake marrying this guy. My sister was in tears, the guests were completely stunned, and the groom just stood there, speechless. Eventually, security escorted the ex out, but the damage had been done. The rest of the ceremony was a blur, and while the wedding went on, the entire day felt incredibly uncomfortable. It wasn't until later that we found out the ex had been trying to reconcile with her for months, but had been ignored. It was the ultimate wedding crasher moment, and no one who was there will ever forget it. Story 11. I'll never forget my uncle's wedding a few years ago, which started off lovely but quickly turned into one of the most awkward experiences of my life. The wedding was beautiful. Everything looked perfect, but things started going downhill at the reception. My aunt, the bride, had 2 daughters from her previous marriage, and they were quite young at the time. They seemed happy enough about the marriage at first, but once the speeches started, it became apparent that something was off. The father of the bride went first, giving a very sweet speech about how proud he was of his daughter and how happy he was to see her find love again. It seemed totally normal until it was the turn of the bride's ex-husband to speak. This was a man who clearly hadn't moved on from their divorce. He got up, took the mic, and said, "I know my daughters will be upset about this, but we have to face the truth. This isn't just a wedding, it's a new chapter." He didn't stop there. He started recounting all of their past issues and even alluded to his suspicions that the bride might have rushed into the marriage. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The bride went pale, her daughters looked uncomfortable, and my uncle, who was sitting at the head table, looked like he wanted to disappear. The awkwardness was so palpable that everyone in the room started to squirm. When he finally finished, no one knew what to say, and the bride didn't even try to thank him for the speech. It was a moment that overshadowed the entire evening. The rest of the reception was a quiet, tense affair. People tried to talk and dance, but no one could get the images of the ex-husband's speech out of their minds. It was one of those situations where the wedding went from happy to a full-on emotional roller coaster in a matter of minutes. Story 12. I attended a wedding last summer that went from fun to horribly awkward in a heartbeat. The ceremony itself was lovely, but the reception took a strange turn when the groom's father got up to give a speech. This wasn't your typical heartwarming proud parent speech. Instead, the groom's dad started recounting bizarre childhood stories about the groom, stories that no one, especially the bride, should have ever heard in public. He started with a funny anecdote about how the groom used to play house as a child with his childhood friend, who, as it turned out, was the bride's older sister. What seemed like an innocent story soon turned very uncomfortable when the dad casually mentioned how wild the groom had been as a teenager. He started talking about how the groom used to sneak out of the house at night and meet up with a string of girls before finally settling down with the bride. He described it as if he was proud of his son's rebellious youth, but the bride's face was turning an unnatural shade of red. The uncomfortable part came when the groom's dad started making jokes about the good old days and how he never thought the groom would settle down with a woman like her. The bride looked like she was about to cry while the groom stood there uncomfortably, shifting from foot to foot. The tension was unbearable. The guests didn't know if they should laugh at the awkwardness or just pretend it wasn't happening. Finally, the groom's mom cut the speech short, but the damage was already done. No one wanted to dance after that. They just awkwardly sipped their drinks and tried to ignore the situation. Story 13. I've been to some weird weddings, but this one took the cake. It was a friend's wedding, and everything started off fine. The bride and groom seemed happy, the guests were laughing, and the food was delicious. But then came the part no one expected, when the groom's best friend, who had known him since high school, decided to give a speech. Instead of a sentimental or funny speech, the best man chose to tell the guests about the groom's deep, emotional bond with his pet hamster. Yes, you read that right, a hamster. The best man spent about 10 minutes describing the various life events the groom had gone through with his pet hamster, including how he would talk to it about his feelings, and even how he cried when it passed away. The worst part was that the groom didn't seem embarrassed. Instead, he was laughing along with the speech, while the bride sat there looking completely dumbfounded. She exchanged uncomfortable glances with her friends, and the rest of us were left in complete silence, trying to figure out if this was a joke or if this guy was seriously this obsessed with the hamster. When the best man finished, the awkwardness in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The bride didn't even clap. The rest of the evening continued in a haze, with people trying to avoid bringing up the hamster. It was a surreal moment that made what should have been a joyous celebration turn into a quiet, uncomfortable evening where everyone pretended the hamster never existed. Story 14. A friend of mine told me about a wedding she attended where the groom's mother went a little too far in making her son's day all about her. The bride had planned everything perfectly, and the ceremony went off without a hitch. However, the reception was a different story. The groom's mother had apparently decided that she would be the star of the show. She began by giving a speech, which was supposed to be a sweet message of welcome to the bride, but it quickly devolved into a tirade about how difficult it had been to raise her son. She went on and on about the countless sacrifices she made for him, describing his childhood in excruciating detail, things no one should ever say about their child in public. She shared embarrassing stories about him not doing well in school, crying over broken toys, and even the time he got in trouble with the law as a teenager. She laughed about these moments, as though they were all just hilarious. But the bride's face was turning pale. The groom, meanwhile, looked like he was ready to run away. But that wasn't the end of it. The groom's mother proceeded to talk about how she knew best for her son and how she was still his number one woman. She actually said, "There's no one who will love my son as much as I do." And at that moment, the room froze. The bride looked like she had been slapped in the face. The groom didn't know how to react, and neither did anyone else in the room. It was so awkward that the reception ended early, and no one was really in the mood to celebrate. The mother's speech was so uncomfortable, it overshadowed the whole event. Story 15. I once attended a wedding where the reception was interrupted by an unexpected and very awkward family drama. The ceremony itself had been beautiful, and the couple looked truly in love. But during the reception, the bride's brother stood up to give a toast, and that's when things took a turn. At first, the speech was fine. He shared sweet memories of growing up with his sister and welcomed the groom into the family. However, about halfway through, he began to tell a story about the bride's wild teenage years. We all thought it would be a funny, lighthearted tale about a teenage rebellion. But it quickly turned dark when he started mentioning her ex-boyfriend. He went on to explain how the bride's ex was the real love of her life and how they had shared some great times together. The groom's face turned pale, and the bride looked like she was about to walk out of the room. The brother continued talking about the ex with increasing detail, and at one point, he even mentioned how he thought the bride's ex had been a better match for her than the groom. The room fell dead silent, and the bride, visibly upset, stood up and walked out. It was an awful moment, and no one knew what to say after. The groom tried to salvage the night, but the tension was palpable. The bride eventually came back, but the rest of the evening felt like a giant, awkward pause. No one really danced, and the happy couple didn't even share a proper first dance. The awkwardness from the brother's toast stuck with everyone for the rest of the evening, and I'm pretty sure it was a wedding none of us would ever forget for the wrong reasons. Story 16. A few years ago, I attended a wedding that started off beautifully, but things took an unexpected turn when the bride's mother, who was quite the character, took the floor during the reception. The groom was a lovely guy, but the bride's mom had a reputation for being a bit of a drama. At first, when she stood up for the toast, people were expecting something sweet, maybe a few words about how proud she was of her daughter and welcoming the groom into the family. But instead, she began with, "Well, I never thought I'd see this day," and then went on a long rant about how hard it had been to get her daughter to marry someone decent. She started listing all of the bride's past boyfriends, giving uncomfortable details about why none of them were good enough. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to the groom and said, "I hope you're ready to be the man she needs. She's been through a lot with the wrong ones." The tension was unbearable. The bride's face was completely flushed, and she barely kept her composure while her mom rambled on. What made it even worse was when the bride's mom brought up her own failed marriages, claiming she was just trying to make sure my daughter doesn't make the same mistakes I did. You could feel the discomfort spreading through the room as guests exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or just sit in silence. The groom's parents seemed equally horrified, and people were shifting in their seats, trying not to make eye contact. After what felt like forever, the bride's mom finally wrapped up the speech, but it was clear that the mood was broken. The rest of the evening was full of forced smiles and uncomfortable small talk, as no one could stop talking about that speech. Story 17. I was at a wedding a couple of years ago where, for some reason, things went horribly wrong when the newlyweds had their first dance. It was a simple, sweet affair with a beautiful venue, a fantastic meal, and all the typical wedding festivities. But the moment the couple took to the dance floor, things went off course. The bride and groom had chosen a romantic slow song, and they began to sway gently to the music. But after a minute or so, the groom seemed to get a little nervous. He kept looking over his shoulder and then suddenly stopped dancing and said, "I'm sorry, I'm just not really a dancer." The bride, trying to laugh it off, suggested they continue, but the groom froze up. Instead of trying to continue, he turned to his best man, who had been standing by the edge of the dance floor, and said, "Can you step in and dance with her instead? I can't handle this." The best man, looking horrified, reluctantly stepped in and took the bride's hand, while the groom awkwardly retreated to the side. The entire room watched in stunned silence as the best man danced with the bride, while the groom sulked in the background, looking completely embarrassed. No one knew what to say, and you could hear the faint murmur of nervous laughter from some of the guests. The awkwardness didn't end there. After a few minutes, the groom came back to the floor and tried to salvage the moment by awkwardly pulling the bride into his arms, but it was clear that the mood had been broken. The rest of the reception carried on, but you could tell no one was really having fun after that. Everyone kept talking about how bizarre it was that the groom had essentially abandoned his bride during their first dance. It was the most uncomfortable, cringeworthy moment I've ever witnessed at a wedding. Story 18. This one happened at a wedding I attended a few years ago, where the entire day was overshadowed by a bizarre family drama. The bride's uncle, who was known for his fiery temper, was seated at a table near the stage. Everything seemed fine during the ceremony, and the couple exchanged vows without issue. But when the reception began, it was like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. The bride's uncle, who had been drinking heavily at the bar, suddenly stood up during the speeches. He was clearly tipsy, but no one thought it would lead to the chaos that followed. He started by raising his glass to the couple, but then things took a strange turn. He started yelling about how the groom wasn't good enough for his niece. He didn't stop there. He began recounting stories from when the bride was younger, talking about her mistakes and the times she had made poor choices in life. The bride, sitting at the head table, looked like she was about to crawl under it. The groom tried to defuse the situation by offering a nervous laugh, but the uncle wasn't done. He then made an incredibly inappropriate comment about how the family knew the groom wasn't the best option, but he's the best we could get. At that point, the bride broke down in tears, and the groom had to ask someone to escort the uncle out. People were mortified, and the rest of the reception felt completely off. You could tell that no one wanted to celebrate any. The bride tried to pull herself together, but there was no way to undo the damage that had been done. No one talked about it openly, but everyone knew that the rest of the night had been ruined. Story 19. A friend of mine had a wedding where the groom's ex-girlfriend showed up unexpectedly. It wasn't a huge shock that she was invited, as they had mutual friends, but no one expected her to show up in full wedding attire. Apparently, she had misunderstood the dress code and showed up in a white dress. It wasn't even a casual white dress. It was a full-on gown, looking like something a bride would wear. The moment she walked into the reception, people went silent. The bride, who had been on cloud nine up until that point, suddenly froze. The groom's face went pale, and you could see the panic in his eyes. The ex-girlfriend smiled brightly, clearly not understanding the awkwardness she was creating. She walked up to the groom and congratulated him, saying how happy she was for him and his new bride, but then she insisted on getting a picture with them, together. The bride was clearly uncomfortable, and the groom was stuck in an awkward position of trying to be polite while also hoping his ex would leave. She didn't. The ex-girlfriend stayed for the entire reception, mingling with guests and trying to make herself the center of attention. The bride's family was visibly upset, and the groom's parents were too embarrassed to intervene. The ex even made a speech at the end of the night, toasting to the couple's happiness in a tone that everyone could tell was laced with bitterness. It was one of those weddings where everything seemed perfect until one person's bad decision completely ruined the vibe. The rest of the night felt like people were walking on eggshells, trying to avoid any more awkward interactions with the ex. It wasn't a wedding anyone involved would ever want to repeat. Story 20. This one takes the cake for the most awkward wedding I've ever been to. It was my childhood friend's wedding, and everything was going smoothly until the bride's father gave his speech. Now, her father was a bit of a character, but we didn't expect him to go off the rails during what should have been a sweet moment. Instead of giving the typical, "I'm so proud of my daughter" speech, the bride's father launched into a bizarre rant about how the groom wasn't good enough for her. He started by explaining how he always thought she deserved better, and how he'd hoped she'd marry someone who could actually take care of her. He kept going on about how he had reservations about the groom, which no one expected. The bride's face turned white, and the groom sat there in shock, unsure whether he should defend himself or just remain quiet. The father then mentioned how, as a father, He always thought he would protect his daughter from this kind of mistake. The bride was on the verge of tears, and the groom, while trying to maintain his composure, was visibly shaken. The awkwardness lingered in the air, and when the speech finally ended, no one knew what to say. The bride's family was furious with her father, and the groom's family didn't know how to approach the situation. The bride eventually excused herself, and the groom followed, but it was clear that the whole reception was tainted. The rest of the night was filled with nervous chatter, and no one really danced or celebrated. It was the most uncomfortable wedding I've ever attended, and it felt like the entire event had been overshadowed by the bride's father's unwelcome words. Story 21. I was at a wedding last summer where everything seemed perfect until the reception turned into an absolute nightmare. The bride and groom were college sweethearts, and everyone was so happy for them. The ceremony was beautiful, the venue was stunning, and the food was amazing. But when it came time for the best man's speech, things went south very quickly. The best man, who was the groom's childhood friend, started his speech in the usual way, talking about how wonderful the couple was and how happy he was to see his friend find someone so special. But then he started telling these stories from the groom's teenage years, and the tone shifted. He began talking about the groom's wild days and some of the crazy things they used to do when they were younger. At first, it was just harmless fun, until he started sharing explicit stories that made everyone cringe. He went into detail about how the groom had been caught in a few compromising situations with girls during their high school years. The bride started laughing nervously, but you could tell she wasn't comfortable. The groom was visibly embarrassed, and his face turned bright red. Then, the best man went a step further. He started talking about the groom's most memorable one-night stand, revealing way too much information for anyone's comfort. The crowd sat in stunned silence, and the bride looked like she was about to faint. The speech didn't stop there. He proceeded to talk about how he never thought the groom would settle down, and how he used to joke that the groom would never get married, let alone to someone like her. By the time the best man finished his speech, the mood in the room was completely ruined. The groom awkwardly thanked him, but the damage had already been done. The rest of the night was filled with awkward conversations and forced smiles. It was the kind of wedding where everyone pretended to have a good time, but the tension was undeniable. Story 22. I attended a wedding a couple of years ago that had a very unusual and uncomfortable moment. It was a destination wedding, and the bride and groom had put a lot of effort into making it special. The ceremony itself went without a hitch, but it was at the reception where things got strained. The groom's brother, who was also his best man, had a history of being a bit of a troublemaker. No one was quite sure what to expect from his speech. At first, the speech seemed normal enough. The brothers started by reminiscing about growing up with the groom, sharing funny stories from their childhood. But then things started to take a bizarre turn. He started bringing up the groom's past relationships, talking about how many girls the groom had dated before meeting the bride. He laughed about how the groom had always been the ladies' man, and then, without missing a beat, he mentioned a very specific ex-girlfriend who had been in the groom's life just before he met the bride. The groom's face dropped, and the bride looked horrified. The best man went into detail about this ex-girlfriend, describing her in a way that made it clear he still held some unresolved feelings about her. It got worse when he casually dropped that the ex-girlfriend had once given the groom a gift that was too inappropriate to mention in public. The entire room went quiet, and the groom looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The bride, who had been laughing nervously, suddenly became very serious. She stood up and walked away from the head table, clearly upset. The groom ran after her, but the awkwardness in the room remained. People started exchanging uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to react. After the speech, the night seemed to lose its energy. The bride and groom managed to come back and apologize to everyone, but the damage was done. The rest of the reception felt tense, and no one could stop talking about the best man's speech. It was the kind of wedding where you felt like you were in the middle of a soap opera. Story 23. This one happened at my cousin's wedding a few years ago. Everything seemed to be going well until the reception, where the groom's mother decided to make an unscheduled appearance during the festivities. The groom's mother, who was notorious for being overbearing, had always been very involved in her son's life. And I mean very involved. During the reception, the bride and groom were about to have their first dance when the groom's mother suddenly jumped up, grabbed the microphone, and announced, "Before they dance, I'd like to say something." Everyone froze, wondering what was going on. She began by talking about how much she loved the groom and how she had always been there for him. But then she started saying things that made everyone in the room extremely uncomfortable. She went on about how no woman would ever be good enough for her son, and how lucky the bride was that he had finally decided to settle down. She also mentioned, in graphic detail, how the groom had been so picky over the years, and how he'd never been interested in anyone who didn't meet his high standards. The bride stood there in shock, her face turning bright red. The groom looked like he had seen a ghost. What really crossed the line was when she started talking about how the first girl the groom ever fell in love with was a girl from his high school who had a perfect figure, basically making the bride feel like she was just another in a long line of women who hadn't quite measured up in her eyes. The bride didn't even try to hide her tears at this point, and the groom's face was completely pale. The guests didn't know whether to laugh nervously or just stare at the floor in awkward silence. The groom's mother finally sat down after what felt like an eternity, and there was this heavy, uncomfortable silence. The bride and groom eventually danced, but the energy had completely shifted. The rest of the evening felt strange, and no one really knew how to act. It was one of those moments where you just knew it would be the topic of conversation for years to come. Story 24. A friend of mine once told me about a wedding where the best man's speech turned into a complete disaster. The groom was a bit of a joker and had a very close-knit group of friends. The best man, who was known for his sense of humor, had been preparing his speech for months. However, no one could have predicted just how awkward things would get. At first, the speech started like any other, with the best man talking about his long friendship with the groom and their fun memories together. But then he began telling a story about the groom's first love, which apparently wasn't his current wife. The best man shared how the groom had been infatuated with this girl years ago and how they almost got married until things fell apart in the most embarrassing way. He detailed how the groom had gotten dumped at the altar, and the bride's family had even found out about it because the groom had started dating someone else immediately after the breakup. The entire room went silent, and you could see the bride's face drop as the best man kept talking. He went on to say that the groom had never really gotten over that first love and that this one might just be a rebound. The groom looked like he wanted to punch the best man, but instead, he just awkwardly laughed it off. The bride, however, was not laughing. She had tears in her eyes, and you could tell she was trying to hold it together for the sake of the wedding. By the time the speech ended, no one knew how to respond. The groom pulled the best man aside, clearly angry, and the bride excused herself to the bath. The rest of the night was filled with awkward small talk and people tiptoeing around the obvious tension. The wedding was still beautiful, but the energy was forever tainted by that ill-timed speech. Story 25. At a wedding I attended a few years ago, I witnessed one of the most uncomfortable moments of my life. The groom's family had always been a little quirky, but no one expected the drama that unfolded during the reception. The bride and groom were both fantastic people, and everything seemed perfect until the bride's father gave his speech. Her father started with a heartfelt message about how proud he was of his daughter and how happy he was to see her marry the man she loved. But then, things took an unexpected turn. He began talking about how he had always thought his daughter would never settle for anyone less than perfect, and how he had never really liked any of the groom's past relationships. He didn't stop there. He began listing the groom's ex-girlfriends one by one, recounting details about each one that no one had any business knowing. The bride was visibly uncomfortable, and the groom's face turned bright red. The bride's father continued by mentioning that he had never thought his daughter would lower her standards by marrying someone with so much baggage. The room fell silent, and you could feel the tension build. The groom tried to laugh it off, but it was clear that everyone was feeling the awkwardness. The bride finally stood up, walked over to her father, and whispered something in his ear. Her father stopped mid-sentence, looked embarrassed, and quickly apologized. The damage, however, had been done. The rest of the evening was a series of uncomfortable silences, and no one really enjoyed the reception after that. It was the kind of moment you wish you could forget, but everyone who was there would always remember the awkward speech that nearly ruined the wedding. Story 26. I was at a wedding last summer that took a strange turn during the ceremony. The bride and groom were absolutely perfect for each other, and everyone could see that from the moment they stepped onto the altar. However, the groom's sister, who was supposed to be a bridesmaid, had a bit of a meltdown right before the vows. It all started when the bride's father got up to give his speech. He had been a little tipsy, but not enough to cause any trouble, or so we thought. He was about halfway through talking about how proud he was of his daughter when the groom's sister suddenly stood up yelling, "This is all a mistake." She wasn't even standing at the back. She was sitting in the front row right next to the bride's family, so it caused a huge stir. Apparently, the groom's sister had always had a secret crush on and, in her mind, had convinced herself that he was the only man who truly understood her. At the moment, she stood up and screamed that she couldn't let her brother marry that she was taking him away from her forever. It felt like a movie scene, but it was very real and incredibly uncomfortable. The bride looked completely confused and hurt, and the groom didn't know what to do. Everyone was staring, and the groom's mother was trying to calm down the sister. The father of the bride had to step in and after a tense few minutes, they escorted her out of the room. The wedding proceeded, but the entire vibe was ruined. It felt like no one knew whether to laugh, cry, or just pretend it didn't happen. Afterward, it was a very awkward reception. The groom and bride tried to salvage it, but people whispered about the scene for the rest of the evening. The bride, visibly upset, went to the restroom multiple times, and the groom was left apologizing to everyone. The whole experience was bizarre and unsettling, and I'm sure it left an emotional scar for both the bride and Story 27. At my friend's wedding a few years ago, the best man's speech ended up being the absolute highlight, and not in a good way. The groom and best man were longtime friends, so everyone expected a heartfelt, funny speech. However, what we got was far from that. The best man started off with the usual humor, sharing memories of the groom's more youthful escapades. But soon, he began revealing way too much about the groom's past, things that no one was prepared to hear. The best man described in vivid detail the groom's adventures before meeting his wife, including some extremely embarrassing and very private stories. He even started talking about a particular wild night they shared in Vegas, where the groom allegedly lost control after a few too many drinks. But the real bombshell came when he mentioned the groom's ex-fiancée, who was apparently the love of his life before the bride. At that point, the bride's face went completely pale, and the groom started sweating profusely. The best man casually dropped that the groom and his ex had been engaged, and they had been on the brink of marriage before he met the bride. He even joked that he thought this one would be another short-lived fling, until he realized that the groom actually settled down for real. The room fell silent. The bride looked like she was about to cry, and the groom was frantically trying to intervene, but the best man, completely oblivious, kept going. Eventually, the bride excused herself from the table and went to the bathroom, while the groom stood there, embarrassed beyond belief. The rest of the night was awkward. People tried to keep the mood light, but the damage was done. The whole reception was filled with nervous chatter, and there was a constant undercurrent of tension. Everyone knew the best man had crossed a line, and no one was sure how to move forward. Story 28. This wedding story comes from a wedding I attended a few years ago, where the bride's cousin made the reception incredibly awkward. The cousin was one of the maid of honor's closest friends and had been a part of the wedding planning from the very beginning. The bride was always sweet and kind, and everyone was excited to see her marry the love of her life. However, things took a dramatic turn when the cousin decided to give an impromptu speech. At first, it seemed like a nice, heartfelt message about how much she admired the bride and her relationship with the groom. But then she veered off topic, launching into a bizarre tangent about her own love life. She began talking about how she had always been the single one in the family, and how she had struggled with finding someone as perfect as the groom. She then began to insinuate that the bride had been lucky to find someone so amazing, while the cousin had always been left behind. It wasn't just a few offhand comments. She kept going. She began describing in great detail her own failed relationships, and how she had never been able to find someone who made her feel the way the bride's groom did. The entire room was awkwardly silent. The bride's face was frozen in a smile, but you could see the discomfort in her eyes. The groom just stood there, completely stiff. The cousin wasn't done. She then started talking about how she had tried everything to find love, even comparing herself to the bride, suggesting that she wasn't pretty enough or worthy enough to have someone like the groom. The bride's maid of honor had to step in and cut the speech short, and the cousin quickly excused herself from the microphone. The rest of the night felt incredibly strained, with people avoiding eye contact and the bride trying to hold back tears. The reception went on, but the whole evening had been forever overshadowed by the cousin's uncomfortable speech. Story 29. One wedding I went to a few years ago had an unexpected, uncomfortable moment during the reception that no one could have predicted. The couple seemed perfect for each other, and everyone was excited to see them marry. But during the wedding speeches, the groom's father, who had a reputation for being overly blunt, decided to make a surprise announcement. The groom's father, after giving a fairly typical speech about how proud he was of his son and welcoming the bride into their family, suddenly turned the conversation to the groom's special talents. He started talking about how proud he was of his son's achievements, everything from school to sports, and then mentioned how the groom was always good at everything he put his mind to. That part was fine. But then the father continued with, "Well, except for relationships. You see, my son has always been bad at keeping girlfriends for long." There was an awkward laugh from the guests, but the father wasn't done. He went on to say how the groom finally found the one who could put up with him, the bride, and that he was proud that this one stuck around. The room went silent. The bride's face turned beet red, and the groom awkwardly shifted in his seat. The father tried to play it off like a joke, But the tension in the room was undeniable. The groom, trying to save the moment, stood up and gave his father a hug, but the damage had already been done. The bride managed a tight smile, but the awkwardness lingered in the air for the rest of the night. The rest of the reception was just uncomfortable small talk. People avoided making eye contact with the bride and groom, and everyone tried to pretend like that moment hadn't happened. It was one of those situations where you just wished you could leave, but the awkwardness made it nearly impossible to relax for the rest of. Story 30. I was at a wedding where the best man's speech ended up being a complete disaster, and it had nothing to do with the groom or bride's past, but more with the tension between the bride and her estranged father. The bride and her father had not spoken for years due to unresolved family drama, and everyone was on edge as the father had been invited to the wedding, but his presence was a source of deep discomfort for the bride. The best man, who had been friends with the groom for years, took the microphone for his speech. He started off by talking about the groom and his love for the bride, which was nice. However, in an unfortunate lapse of judgment, the best man then started making jokes about family dynamics, specifically about how weddings were supposed to be family reunions. He made a few comments about how awkward family gatherings could be, and before anyone could stop him, he joked that at least the bride's father showed up. It was meant to be a lighthearted dig, but it landed with an unsettling thud. The bride's eyes went wide and she physically recoiled. The groom's face was filled with shock as he tried to cut the best man off, but it was too late. The tension in the room was thick, and no one knew how to react. The bride excused herself immediately, running off to the bathroom while the groom stood there, embarrassed and apologizing to the guests. The rest of the reception felt strained, with everyone trying to tiptoe around the elephant in the room. The wedding that had started off so beautifully had been marred by a single, thoughtless comment, and the rest of the evening was filled with tension and awkward silences. Story 31. I was at a wedding a few years ago that seemed to be going smoothly until the best man's speech took a wild turn. The groom and best man were best friends from childhood, and everyone knew the best man was the life of the party. When it was his turn to speak, we all assumed we'd get some funny stories, maybe a bit of harmless teasing, and a good laugh. At first, he started with some light jokes about the groom's awkward teenage years, talking about how he used to be terrible with women, and how he had once tried to flirt by quoting movie lines. Everyone was laughing, and the groom was even chuckling along. But then the best man's tone shifted. He started recounting a story from the groom's high school years, one that was meant to be funny but quickly turned uncomfortable. He talked about the groom's crazy ex, who had allegedly shown up uninvited to the wedding, threatening to steal him back. Everyone thought it was a joke, but the best man kept digging into the story. He went into detail about how the ex-girlfriend had caused drama, and how, at one point, she had even shown up at the groom's house sobbing after finding out he was dating the bride. The groom's face slowly turned redder and redder, and the bride's smile turned into a nervous laugh. To make matters worse, the best man then told everyone that the groom had almost gotten back with her after a tearful conversation, but ultimately decided to marry the bride instead. The bride's face dropped, and the groom was visibly uncomfortable, trying to deflect the conversation by making jokes. The awkwardness was palpable, and the rest of the reception felt off. Guests tried to keep the mood light, but no one could stop talking about the bizarre speech. Later on, the bride pulled the groom aside, clearly upset, and the best man realized he had overstepped. But by then, it was too late. The awkward tension lingered in the air for the rest of the night. It was one of those moments that no one would ever forget, but wished they could.